Well, welcome to my first ever Camtasia presentation. This is in lieu of the lecture that would be for today. I'd like you all to take notes. I would like to see what your notes look like. I think the biggest problem that I'm going to have, and perhaps you'll have, is how to do this without sounding boring, and how to convey things without being able to directly interact with you. So I'm guessing on some of the things that you might have difficulty with, so pay attention. If you do have questions afterwards, I don't expect to go over this PowerPoint in detail when I return. This is your lecture, but I will be happy to answer questions about it. So this is on Chapter 15, Tracts of the Spinal Cord. I've culled the chapter down into a smaller subset of things you need to know. So everything you need to know should be contained in this presentation. The nice thing about this presentation is you'll be able to watch it a second and a third time if in fact you find it goes too fast. It's an interesting but a complex chapter, and I don't intend to cover all of it, but just the essentials. And since we've spent so much time on the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is what connects the central nervous system to the periphery, it's important to know some of the contents of this chapter. First question I want you to think about is, why did I pick the image that I did that appears on the left-hand side of the page? So why did I pick this particular image? And I want you to write down what you think that looks like. And then I'll give you my idea about the image in about 10 seconds. So write down what you think it looks like. The reason that I chose it was because I think it looks like the information superhighway. And to me, that's the best representation of the spinal cord. Ascending or sensory information needs to get up into the brain, and descending information needs to come out of the brain, and it needs these large conduits, if you will, collections of neurons that carry information from one place to another. Unlike this, in some respect, it's more like I-5, where you have a separation of northbound and southbound lanes, or any major freeway. We don't have north and south on the same side. We have a northbound lane that is 3 or 4 lanes wide, and a southbound lane which is 3 or 4 lanes wide. And that's exactly the sort of the perfect conception of the spinal cord. We've got two major goals for this chapter. The first is I want you to be able to identify sensory and motor tracts of the spinal cord, including what is a tract. If you remember from the previous chapter, you should be able to identify that. So write down a simple definition. A tract is, and I'll give you about 15 seconds. A tract is a collection of axons within the central nervous system. So the second thing we'll do is describe how movements are planned in sequence, and it's far more complex than we give it credit for. But it'll be our introduction to the brain. So in the second slide, and by the way, this presentation is only about 10 or 12 slides long, so it won't last very long. What you'll notice here in some places, particularly at the bottom like this, you'll see that there are questions embedded, and there is a little sort of quiz at the end, so I want you to answer these questions and compare your answers. The figures that we see in this slide are things that you already know. It's a cross-section of the spinal cord. And last time in the previous chapter we had focused on most of the gray matter, the centrally located gray matter that we see. And we also focused on the ventral roots, which we referred to the off-ramps, and the dorsal roots, which were the sensory inputs to those regions. This is a nice transverse section, but the problem is it doesn't give us a sense of the dynamism of the central nervous system or the spinal cord, in part because it doesn't convey what's happening at levels above and below. So for this particular slide, I'd like you to answer this question. What are motor nuclei? Motor nuclei are located in the anterior great horn and the lateral great horn. But what are they? How would you classify them? The answer will be given at the end of this presentation. I'll give you about 10 seconds to answer. It's okay to talk to someone. This doesn't have to be a private sort of a quiz. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I call this the elevator slide because it gives us the first idea that information that's coming in from the dorsal root is going to be conveyed in some respect up to the central nervous system. So here we have on the left side here, these are sort of arrows indicating sensory fibers that are going to move up or ascend toward the central nervous system, the hierarchy of the brain. What we'll notice is in all of the white area over here and the white matter over here, that this is where we find the tracts. The gray area is where we have all the cell-body connections, but when we convey information up toward the brain or information back down toward, it's a motor output, it's going to be in the white fibers, which will then connect up and synapse in the anterior gray horn and then leave. We'll see some examples of that a little bit later. So recognize that these tracts function as elevators, that they carry information up and they carry information down. This slide is not in your book, but I liked it for a couple of reasons. One, because it was color-coded, and two, that it showed us cross-sectional levels. Interestingly enough, we have different kinds of sections here. In the spinal cord, we end up having transverse sections of the spinal cord, and then we end up having, what kind of section is this? A frontal section of the brain. So what we find out is that there's an ordering of neurons. When a sensory neuron comes in from the periphery, it'll pass through the dorsal root and into the posterior gray horn. From there, that information needs to be carried up into the brain, and it's going to end up all the way up here in what's referred to as the primary somatosensory cortex. But how does it get there? Well, the first thing it does, it doesn't use one neuron. You have one neuron that conveys the information to the spinal cord, and this is noted in green. And we refer to this as a first-order neuron. It's the first neuron in the sequence. We then have a synapse within the cord, and we'll see something else here, and I'll discuss this in a little bit. It actually crosses over from what would be the left side or the right side of this spinal cord to the left side of the spinal cord before it ascends. So we go from a pale green neuron to a pale blue neuron up through one of these little elevator shafts, and we'll find out this is the tract that it's being carried. It synapses in the thalamus, and we'll find out when we get to the brain that the thalamus functions as a relay for just about every ascending information that goes up. After that synapse in the thalamus, we find out that it connects to a third neuron, which we refer to as the third order neuron, and that connects the thalamus into the sensory cortex. So we have three neurons for sensory processing: a primary or first order neuron, which carries information to the cord; a second order neuron, which carries ascending information to the thalamus; and a third order neuron, which carries information from the thalamus into the primary sensory cortex. If information is going to go to the cortex, this is the most common set of structures we find: primary, secondary, and tertiary neurons. we'll see some examples where we don't have 3 neurons that carry information. We only have 2. I do have a question for you at this time. This isn't part of the formal quiz, but it's a question to answer as we're going through. Are these neurons, the green, the blue, and the red, are they organized in series or are they organized in parallel? You have to remember something about the neuronal processing slide that we had talked about previous. I'll give you about 10 seconds to answer that question, and then we'll go on. Talk about it with a friend. The answer, of course, was series. They are located, one connects to another that connects to a third. Parallel would be if we had a sort of a divergent synapse there, and we had a second order neuron that would carry information up, and then we would have parallel processes that were going on. On to the next slide. So this is figure 15.3 from the book, and there's a couple important concepts here. The first I want to talk about is something called decussation. And decussation, this odd term up here, refers to the fact that information crosses from one side of the cord and sends information to the opposite side of the brain, and we refer to that as contralateral control. And in some of the videos that we'll watch, we'll see this as exemplary. And we'll find out that oftentimes the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and that information from left sensory systems goes to the right side of the brain. The information can cross within the cord, or it can actually cross within the midbrain that we'll see. So we refer to this as decussation of the neurons, and the concept here is contralateral control, which means control of one side of the body from the opposite side of the brain. Again, we can see a red, a white, and a black neuron, which represents the first, second, and third order neurons. So, question number 2, which we'll get back to, and this one's the easy one. There's some harder ones. What color is the third order neuron? The other thing I wanted to talk about on this slide was something called the sensory homunculus. And I'll give you a different image. And despite that, looks like a scary uncle, or perhaps someone you might find in Central Park in New York. What it really is, it's a fictitious representation of something called the homunculus. And homunculus is Latin for little human. And what we can see here is, if you look at the characteristics of this, we see enlarged hands, we see a relatively small body, we see large eyes, larger nose, but very large lips and tongue. And this actually corresponds to this representation that we can see here, which is the somatosensory cortex, which is the physical map of the body on the brain. And you'll notice that the body occupies a pretty small region of cortex here, but the hand and the face occupy a much larger region of cortex. The homunculus, or this map, is really drawn for the number of receptors that exist within the body that corresponds to the brain. For example, we have a lot more sensation and sensory fibers and sensory receptors in the hand and the lips and the face than we do the abdomen, lateral aspect of the chest, the knee, the thigh. So we see as an overrepresentation in the brain for those areas that have a much greater sensory receptor density. So how are some of these tracts named? Well, they're actually named in a pretty straightforward and simplistic manner. Looking at this particular graph, we have something referred to as the lateral spinothalamic tract. There's actually an anterior spinothalamic tract, and we're not going to get into those details. But let's pay attention to the name. The lateral component just tells you that it exists in the lateral aspect of the spinal cord as opposed to the anterior aspect. So, spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature from the right side of the body, and we can see it decussates and crosses over to the left and is carried to the somatosensory cortex. It's called the spinothalamic tract because it begins in the spinal cord and communicates through the thalamus. So the name, hence the name spinothalamic tract. The other figure that we have here is the spinocerebellar tract. And the spinocerebellar tract also begins in the spinal cord. Now this is a little bit different because we've been talking about mostly somatosensory receptors, or receptors that exist in the skin or in the body. In the spinocerebellar tract, we're talking about proprioceptive information from Golgi tendon organs, muscle spindles, and joint capsules. So if you remember, the proprioceptors are those receptors that bring in information about the position of the body in space. And we'll find out in chapter 16 that the cerebellum is really responsible for stored motor programs and movement and balance components. So in this particular case, what we'll see is we only have 2 neurons as opposed to 3 on this side. We have a sensory neuron coming in from a Golgi tendon organ, let's say in the bicep or in the quadricep. It synapses, one decussates and goes up and then crosses over again. And then we have one that climbs up the also the lateral aspect of the spinal cord, and it ends in the cerebellum. Hence, we get the name spinocerebellar, because its final destination is the cerebellum. So, I want you to take 30 seconds right now and write down the similarities and differences that you observe between these 2 sensory tracts. Please list them on a sheet of paper. So things that we see, one thing we pointed out is the spinothalamic has 3 neurons, the spinocerebellar has 2. The spinothalamic tract crosses at the level of the cord and then ascends. The spinocerebellar both ascends on the same side and crosses. That's a little bit distinctive. One thing we'll find out about these proprioceptive inputs is that they don't come to the cortex, which means that they don't raise the understanding of them in the brain isn't raised to the level of consciousness. For example, this is a physical map of the body that we can see on the cortex, but we really don't have such a map of the body on the cerebellum, at least one that's not very well described. Next slide. So we just finished with sensory tracts, so we're going to transition to motor tracts, and motor tracts are descending tracts. And the key concepts for this are the idea that you have an upper and a lower motor neuron. An upper motor neuron that we see here in red, and we've got 2 different flavors, and I'll describe both of them. The upper motor neuron is the neuron that's located within the central nervous system. It begins in the brain and then synapses either in the medulla or in the spinal cord before exiting. So, and we have 2 different tracts here, so let's follow the longer one per se. This is the most common one that we see. It begins in the primary motor cortex. It will descend down through the brainstem into some level of the cord. It will synapse in that somatic motor nuclei in the anterior gray horn. And then we'll see a second neuron that will leave and target a skeletal muscle. The red is the upper motor neuron, and the black is the lower motor neuron. The other pair of neurons here we have is This is the corticospinal tract that goes from the cortex to the spine. This is the corticobulbar tract that goes from the cortex to the bulb region, or the pons and medulla region. And the difference that we have is the corticospinal tract controls all the skeletal muscles for the trunk and upper and lower extremities, where the corticobulbar tract controls all of muscles for facial expression and neck. So let's get to this compound. So the red are the upper motor neurons and the black are the lower motor neurons. Let's look at the concept of flaccid versus spastic paralysis. Now, you've heard me say before that the muscle is slave to the nerve. And if we just focus on this particular group of skeletal muscles, we can disrupt motor traffic to this by either cutting the upper motor neuron in red or the lower motor neuron in black. And it results in paralysis in both cases, but we call them different things. Let's focus on flaccid paralysis. The word flaccid refers to the fact that there is something that is flabby, it's flesh-like, it has no particular, it's almost fluid-like. And when you cut the lower motor neuron, what you're doing is you're cutting the sensory input to the muscle, and it loses its inherent resting tension or muscle tone. So, and the muscle essentially looks as it has no neuronal input whatsoever, and it lies there kind of like a sleeping dead animal. On the other hand, spastic paralysis results from cutting the upper motor neuron. And when you cut the upper motor neuron, you lose the ability to send impulses down into the cord, but you don't lose the lower motor neuron. So you still have this neuron that's providing input into the skeletal muscle, which provides some degree of tension. We refer to it as spastic because oftentimes you do have tension and it's uncontrolled. One of the difference in characteristics between flaccid and spastic paralysis is flaccid paralysis does not exhibit any reflexes where spastic does. For example, in a spinal cord patient that's a quadriplegic or a paraplegic, if it's an upper motor neuron damage, they still would be able to exhibit a reflex, such as a stretch reflex. So if you tapped on their patellar tendon, that would be able to send the sensory neuron back and connect back up through the motor neuron that goes back to the skeletal muscle, and you get a little bit of a twitch of a contraction. It wouldn't be controlled, and that's why it's referred to as spastic paralysis. So, third question for you. If you cut the upper motor neuron, which form of paralysis occurs? Flaccid or spastic? Here's an example, perhaps a more detailed example, of a number of different fibers. These are all motor tracts. So this is the motor homunculus from the primary motor cortex, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. But these are all motor inputs to the various regions of the body that go down through the cerebrum, down through the medulla, and you'll notice you have some that will go out to motor nuclei of cranial nerves to skeletal muscles that provide for swallowing and facial expression, smiling, blinking, coughing. The majority of them cross within the medulla, and this is referred to as decussation of the pyramid. So decussation just means crossing, in which it will travel down the lateral corticospinal tract, so from the cortex through the spine, and then synapse in the anterior gray horn, and then send that out to skeletal muscles. So everything you see here in red is an upper motor neuron that then synapses in a lower motor neuron, which leads then through the ventral root. Again, this word contralateral comes back. Contralateral control means that the cerebral cortex on the right side of the body controls the muscles on the left side of the body. One thing I wanted to point out in this particular figure over here is that this shows us um, how refined and how defined some of these tracts are that exist within sort of this superhighway. And they exist in the periphery, and they're well-defined bundles of neurons that each provide, sorry about that, which each provide a specific ascending or descending function. And again, the synapses occur in here. For this particular chapter, you don't have to know the names of each specific anatomy for each one of these tracts, but you should know that they exist, and they exist in the periphery in the white matter here. So hold on, we're almost finished. I'm going to talk a little bit about the primary motor cortex to foreshadow what we'll look at in the brain. And what we have here is that motor homunculus that we see, and it's called the primary motor cortex. And this is the version of the motor homunculus compared to the sensory homunculus. Now, you can flip back if you want to look at the sensory homunculus, but I'm going to give you a couple of comparisons. What we see here is that the hands are much larger representations, and the mouth is a much larger representation that we saw previously. So the question I have for you is, what's the most significant difference between the sensory and motor homunculus? And it might not be apparent to you. So I've added a sensory homunculus. And one of the things that you can do is you can actually stair step up. If you look at the little red strip on this particular small little brain, that's the sensory homunculus. And the blue strip, the red strip is the sensory homunculus, and the blue strip is, I'll have to edit that out. If we look at this region right here, we can see that the red strip is the motor homunculus, and just adjacent to it is in this little blue strip, that's the sensory homunculus. So they exist side by side in the brain, and if you compare in the lateral aspects, the tongue and the lips and the face region occupy fairly straightforward structures. Then the next thing we do is we move to the hand in both of these areas, and you'll notice that it's not really a contiguous picture, that the hand and the face are next to one another, even though they don't occupy adjacent places in the body. And then we find that the torso and trunk wrap around this particular one. So I want you to study this physical map and then study this physical map and see if you can find the biggest difference between the sensory and the motor homunculus. I'll give you about 20 seconds and then I'll reveal the answer. I feel like I should be singing the Jeopardy song. So, anyone figure it out? The answer is, you probably aren't going to go there. It's the genitalia. If you look here, we have lots of sensory input from the genitalia. We do not have motor control, in terms of voluntary motor control over the genitalia. Onward. Lastly, I want to talk about somatic control or body control. And we're really going to divide these up into two different elements. First is the planning stage of movement, and then the second is what we actually do when we move. And to give you an idea of the complexity of this, when we're planning movement, we have a region of the cortex called the motor association area. And the motor association area thinks to itself, I want to climb those stairs, I want to open the door, I want to shoot the free throw, I want to write my name on a paper. And it begins then to send out messages into these other regions of the brain. So the decision making starts here. It sends out information to the basal nuclei and the cerebellum as preparation. And in those particular regions, it's going to call up what it remembers about those particular movements. So most adults have a wide variety of movement patterns that they can call up, kind of like physical songs, if you will, that allows them to repeat movements over and over again without thinking about them. So the first thing we do is we decide we're going to do it, and then we plan for it. And it uses these particular elements. Carrying out the movement is far more complex. So the movement is generated from this area called the primary motor cortex, and this red structure that we see, red line right there, is the corticospinal pathway, or the upper motor neuron. That upper motor neuron receives input from the basal ganglia and from the cerebellum and from this motor association area that tells it, contract this group of muscles now in this particular sequence. All the while, the cerebellum is also communicating with the basal ganglia. At this point in time, I don't want you to have, you don't have to have a strong idea of what each one of these brain structures are, but what you should realize is almost the entire motor programming area of the brain contributes information and input to the primary motor cortex. So this upper motor neuron receives the right amount of input to carry out the task as you would plan. Again, this is an extraordinarily complex function, and the fact is, because we can walk and talk and climb stairs and shoot free throws and write our name, and that we can put food in our mouth with a fork and not stab ourselves, we have a very high degree of specificity of movement patterns that are stored within each of these areas, and we'll talk about some of these when we actually get to the brain. The last question I have for you is, what structure is the final recipient structure of all of the motor outflow from the primary motor cortex and the basal ganglia? So to answer this question, what I want you to do is find all of the descending axons, both from the primary motor cortex and the basal ganglia, and identify where they will synapse and what is the final recipient structure, or what's the final synapse from those outputs. I'll give you about 20 seconds and then we'll move on to our quiz. Okay, onward we go. So, the first question we asked several slides back is, what are motor nuclei? And the answer is, they're a collection of neuron cell bodies in the anterior gray horn. Give yourself 2 points if you got that correct. The second question is, what's the color of the third order neuron? You go back to that very first one. The third order neuron was actually, it was the color black. It went from the thalamus up to the cortex. Question number 3, if you cut the upper motor neuron, which form of paralysis occurs? And the correct answer is spastic paralysis, because the lower motor neuron will contribute some degree of neural input, which will provide some tension or tone, which may be spastic or uncontrolled. So a little typo on my part. Last but not least, what's the final recipient of all of the motor outflow from the primary motor cortex and the basal ganglia? And the answer is simply the lower motor neuron. So the lower motor neuron, the neuron that connects the central nervous system to the skeletal muscle, receives all of that particular input. Last but not least, last question, and this is for you to take away. And before I do this, watch this as many times as you need. It may have gone slow for some of you. It may have gone incredibly fast for others of you. But I hope you enjoyed it. So the last question is, if contralateral control means the right brain controls the left side of the body, what's ipsilateral control? Bring that answer to class on Tuesday, and have a good weekend. If you have any questions between now and then, please let me know. And remember, there is a quiz that's open until Sunday night. Thanks, and have a good day.